Are patterns a good way for a beginner to learn the ropes of improvising?
So patterns, like scales, are a developmental tool. They help develop technical proficiency on the instrument and the ability to delineate harmonic structure in your melodic lines. The goal is not to use patterns as a plug-and-play mechanical approach to constructing an improvised solo. It's to teach your brain and your fingers some of the logical melodic pathways through progressions of chords. On a theoretical level, you could think of patterns like mental flashcards that require you to identify and play specific notes relating to a chord. The goal is to be able to recognize the relationship between all notes, meaning that if you know the root of a chord, you understand the way that each of the other 11 notes relates to it. So which is the third, which is the ninth, which is the flat 13th, etc. Practicing scales or patterns, and of course a scale is a pattern, helps you to acquire the key fluency that will allow you to pick and choose notes to form a melody. Now that's the bottom line when you're improvising. We're composing new melodies. We're not trying to consciously play things that we've learned. We're trying to absorb the language to the point that we can respond to what we hear in our own heads and from the other musicians. The things you practice, including patterns, will work their way into your vocabulary, just as a new word can enter your lexicon. But knowing a lot of words won't necessarily make you a great communicator any more than knowing a lot of patterns will make you a great improviser. It's the way you use the vocabulary to express ideas, whether verbal or musical.
You said we should be able to identify the intervallic relationship between all notes. That seems like it would take a long time to learn.
So it's true that developing that kind of intervallic understanding will take some time, but it's not a life's work. It starts out as conscious activity and eventually gets absorbed into the subconscious. So if I asked you to name the flat 13 in the key of F sharp, first you need to remember that the 13 is the same note as the 6th. Then you need to figure out what is the 6th note in an F sharp major scale. Now to do that, there are two rules that I want you to remember. Rule number 1. Each major scale contains one and only one of each letter name, A, B, C, D, E, F, and G. So if you count up from F, the 6th note will be D. This will be true regardless of whether you start with an F flat, an F natural, or an F sharp. The letter name will always be D. Then you need to figure out whether the D is flat, or sharp, or natural. So the choice then is between D natural and D sharp. The key signature for F sharp would give you the answer, but if you're unsure of that, you could think first of the key of F, which is 1 flat. Well, 1 flat will always be B flat, so by default, the 6th note will be D natural in the key of F, and by extension, D sharp in the key of F sharp. Now still, the thought process is not complete, because the question was, what is the flat 13th in the key of F sharp? Now some might logically say D flat. But you have to remember that by saying flat 13, we imply that the note is lowered by a half step. If the note is D sharp, then lowering it a half step turns it into D natural, not D flat. Now, of course, if you were going through this thought process while you were improvising, the chord would be long gone before you arrived at the answer. But you have to remember that whatever you're practicing today is laying the groundwork for the future, where you've absorbed the information to the point that you no longer have to think about it.
Would it make as much sense to transpose patterns chromatically rather than through the cycle?
The video that sparked this question is specifically focused on patterns that'll help you navigate a succession of dominant chords. Now, most of the time, dominant chords will resolve following the cycle of fifths, so practicing them in this order will have the most real-world significance. When you improvise on a set of chord changes, you want the focus to be on the movement from one chord to the next, rather than focusing on what you can play on each individual chord. That puts the emphasis on the melodic line, thinking horizontally as opposed to vertically. Now you can see in the patterns that I demonstrated that thought is given to how one moves to the next. Now there are actually times when dominant chords might move by half steps. The last 4 bars of Sweet Georgia Brown is one example, and tritone substitution would be another. So an argument can certainly be made for practicing patterns chromatically as well as through the cycle. Now you should consider other intervals as well. For example, if you practice patterns through a cycle of major thirds, that lays the groundwork for a tune like Giant Steps. Now note that playing through the cycle, or chromatically, will take you through all 12 keys. A cycle of major thirds lands you back at the beginning after only 3 keys, so you'll need to make some adjustments to hit them all. Beyond the practical implications, whatever we do repetitively eventually becomes rote, so changing up the order in which we move through the keys challenges our brain, and for that reason alone, it's a good idea.
Are the patterns you play in the videos similar to Coltrane patterns?
So I'm assuming that the question refers to the Coltrane matrix, which was a term applied to a harmonic progression based on modulations of a major third, which divide an octave exactly into 3 keys. Giant steps is the most famous example. The patterns I demonstrated follow the circle of fifths, which takes you to a nearby key, meaning one in which only one note changes. Modulating by a major third takes you to a key in which 4 out of 7 notes are different. Now that's a dramatic harmonic shift, and navigating that shift is what makes giant steps so challenging. If you analyze Trane's solos from that era, you'll find that he uses patterns that are not all that different from the patterns that I showed you, in that they're based on chord tones and scale degrees. I've made the point in other videos that the more dramatically the harmony shifts, the better it sounds to stay low on the chords. Triads can sound great if they're outlining a strong harmonic progression. Now, before Coltrane wrote giant steps, there were tunes that utilized a chord progression based on major thirds. Have You Met Miss Jones is one example, written in 1937. To contend with the rapidly moving key centers in 2 different directions really requires a formulaic or pattern-based approach. Without getting those patterns under your fingers, you face a challenge like poor Tommy Flanagan did on the original recording. Now, in the 50-plus years since that album was released, a lot of people have mastered those patterns, but I've yet to hear anybody employ them as musically as Coltrane did.
How can patterns be used to create a melody rather than sounding like a mechanical exercise?
Patterns are a means to an end, not an end in themselves. They help you acquire the technical and conceptual fluidity that you need to be able to improvise freely. So to answer this question, I'll start by reversing it. How can a melody be used to create a pattern? Any melody can be expressed as a series of numbers relating to scale or chord degrees. You could number every note as it relates to the key signature, and then apply the numbers to a new key to transpose the melody. This is where jazz transposition is somewhat different than classical, where you may be more likely to transpose the individual notes on the basis of intervals, rather than as scale degrees related to the key signature. Better yet is to number the melody notes relative to the chords, and then transpose all the chords to a new key. This requires a higher level of thought and harmonic understanding. It will take patience and diligence, but it gets you to where you need to be, where you understand a note as it relates to the chordal structure that accompanies it. So patterns can then be seen as melodies, or if you like, melodic cells. If you create a line that accurately outlines the chord changes, that'll be a melody in and of itself, and it can sound pretty good, especially if it's played with good tone quality and time feel. Coltrane's solo on Giant Steps is a high-level example of that. It may not be the end goal. It wasn't for Trane or for others for whom the melodic line supersedes specific or obvious delineation of the harmony. Wayne Shorter might be a good example of that. But for someone who's looking to learn the language of jazz, being able to accurately represent the harmony in your melodic lines is a critical skill. Patterns can enhance your ability to do that. They won't on their own turn you into a creative improviser. But as part of an overall process that includes learning tunes and transcribing solos, they can provide benefits that justify the time and effort.